In this video, we're going to carry on using Fusion 360 Forms to reverse engineer a car fender. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, part 2, we're going to carry on reverse engineering this Fiat Fender using scan data. Now, if you haven't watched the first video, we spent about an hour to get the rough shape of this Fiat Fender right. So we did a little bit of work in terms of getting the overall shape, working on the fender flare, and just sort of getting the overall fender shape to about the right spot. So we're pretty close to the actual fender. Now, if you followed along with the first video, go ahead and carry on with your file. If you didn't, or you just want to start where we are now, then you can go ahead and download the file that you see on the screen from the description in the video. What we're going to do is we're going to make a couple of tweaks to the overall shape, and we want to continue to create the shape of the fender. We're going to try to go forward around to the center grille area, and we're going to create as much as we can. Now, once we get to the headlight opening area, then we can start to add the detail for this crease here. You can see that the fender is a little bit wider here, so now is the time for us to start to make some of these adjustments. Most of the time, I like to work in box display, and this is sort of a good practice for us to work in box display because it really helps us understand the underlying shape or the curvature that we're dealing with. And it really is much easier for us to make good, clean, quality surfaces. Now, in the end, we will have to be using smooth display to make sure that we are getting the correct shape. But I'm going to use box display for right now. I'm going to sort of rotate this around, and I'm going to play around with using modify edit form. And I want to get this fender shape as close as possible. So I'm going to rotate this around just a little bit. And this area here, if we hide the mesh, you can see that we've got these two edges here. Now, it can be kind of tricky for us to sort of worry about this. So one thing that we can do at this point in time is we can delete this inside edge. So we can double click on it and delete it. Now that will affect the overall smooth display because now what we've done is we've gotten rid of that lip there, but we can add it back once we're ready. So again, it helps us because now we're not having to move as much geometry. So I'm going to bring back the mesh. Now when I go to modify edit form, I'm no longer worried about missing that little edge. I can just grab that vertex and I can begin to pull it out. I can do the same thing down here, pull that vertex out, and I can take a look at smooth display, but once again, it's not going to be quite right until we add that edge back in. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to take this entire edge, I'm going to push it back a little bit because we were kind of a little too far out. So I'm going to take that edge and push it back, do the same thing down here. And once I get relatively close, I am going to probably take a couple of these edges and push them back just a little bit. Now 5 millimeters looks like it's probably too much, so I'm going to manually enter -1. We're starting to see the underlying mesh there, so that looks pretty good. Up here, I probably am going to have to push this back a little bit. So I'm going to click on it. I'm going to say -1. That looks pretty good. Again, we can check the smooth display, and you can see that we've got some of this sort of peeking through. So this edge could probably go back a little bit. I'm going to try -1 millimeter there. Check the smooth display, and it looks pretty close. So you can see that we're starting to see the mesh there. And again, this is really intended at a race car, so we're not trying to perfectly match because ultimately it's going to get adjusted just a little bit anyways. But when we rotate this model around, you'll notice that some of the form body shows through and disappears, and then some of the mesh comes through. That's what we're really looking for when we're exactly matching the mesh or we're really close to it. So that's a good sign. I'm going to go back to my box display. Now I want to push these edges here. I'm going to push them back a little bit. So again, I'm going to select this and then manually enter -1, check my smooth display, and that looks pretty good. Again, you can kind of see the mesh coming through here. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but we're just looking to get this pretty close. Now, before we add that edge back in, the one on the inside of the fender lip, I want to make sure that I go ahead and move to the front and try to make sure that this is okay as well. And you can see that it's way inside here. So this entire edge needs to move forward. I'm going to go ahead and bring that forward. And I just want to check the smooth display. And this vertex here that's down inside of here, that probably needs to move forward. It can be kind of hard to see when we're actually taking a look at the mesh. So I'm going to hide it, select that point, and then I'm going to pull it out in the X direction. And then take a look at the smooth display. So that vertex probably needs to go in a little bit. And this one probably needs to go in a little bit. Again, box display. And we want to be careful with something like this. This is not a result that we want. When we take a look at smooth display, you can see that it's giving me this little bump or this little lip here. And those are the kinds of things that using box display is really going to help us identify. So when we have geometry that kind of looks like this, that's not a good result. So we're going to pull this part out a little bit. And again, we don't want a straight line. If you have a straight line between these 3 points, then it's going to be bad geometry. Now, that's not universally the case, but as sort of a general rule of thumb, I like to make sure that there is at least a little bit of a difference between those. Now, if we go back to the smooth display, we bring the mesh back, that looks a little bit closer. It's not perfect because we do need to take this entire thing in, but we have to build more geometry here, so I'm not super concerned about it. If we want to pull it all back, we certainly can. Let's take a look at the smooth display. I'm going to grab all of these, probably leave that vertex there, and just pull it back in just a little bit. And this is a little bit too far in, so I'm going to reset the pivot point. I'm going to put it over here. Then I'm going to scale this in this direction. Double check the box display to make sure that we aren't, again, producing bad geometry. And that looks pretty good. Smooth display. Everything looks pretty good so far. So now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and add that edge back in. So we're going to double click on it to select it. We're going to go to Insert Edge, and we're going to put it relatively close. The closer we get it, the tighter the transition is going to be, because essentially what we're doing is we're saying that the curvature going from this back edge into this point and then wrapping around, having these 2 edges close together is going to make that transition much tighter. So if we use Control and 4 to hide our edges, you can see that that's a really tight transition. Now this is going to be problematic for something like a fiberglass mold, so we can double click on that edge. We can go to Slide Edge. You have to find where the actual manipulator is. It's down here. And I'm just going to pull that back away and say OK, and just sort of decrease that transition there. Now some cars, again, will have like a flat spot there. It's more traditional from, I'd say, probably about the 80s, when car design started changing in the 80s to more boxy shapes. We started to see like a flat section here on the fenders. When you go back to the 60s and the 70s, you typically would see more rounded geometry here. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. So that looks pretty good. Again, sometimes we'll get these little things that are kind of graphic issues. We can always double check them by using our inspect and curvature analysis. I'm not too concerned with it at this stage. I just want to rotate this around and just sort of visually take a look at it. I also want to bring the mesh back and just get a good idea as to how close we are to the original. We are pretty close. I'm pretty happy with this result so far. Some of the areas that we need to fix, we're obviously not all the way to the back edge of the fender, and over here we're a bit high. So I want to start to adjust this area here to get a little bit closer to the fender. Now, when we take a look at this in box display, it's going to be harder for us to tell exactly where to go. But one thing you're going to notice is here, this looks like a straight edge, which obviously, as I mentioned, is problematic. So that's something that we want to fix. But for this example, I'm going to use smooth display, and I'm going to take these vertices on the back edge, and I'm going to begin moving them down. Again, trying to get closer to the fender shape. I'll probably pull this one down a little bit. I'm only working in a single direction. And what I'm trying to do is, again, get as close as I can to that fender shape. Now, as we're looking at this, there are some other areas where we need to sort of move. I'm going to move these, and this one up here needs to come down. Now, you'll notice that the rest of this looks like it's completely inside of the scan now, which means that we're probably going to be a little bit low. So if I hide the fender and I rotate this around, this can be kind of tricky for us to see if we're inside of the fender or not. Now, there are things that we can do in the design workspace where we can right click on a body and we can use opacity control, and this does work on meshes. It gets a little bit tricky because it still doesn't really help us get a great idea of where things are. You can rotate around and you can kind of see what's going on, but it does make it a little bit tricky. So what I suggest that we do is we leave the opacity at 100% and we use edit form and we just find this edge and we bring it up a little bit. So I'm going to bring it up again until I start to see it come through, and you can see that it's higher in the back than it is in the front. So this tells me that the front is quite a bit lower, and as soon as the back starts to come out, I'm going to reset my pivot point to back here, and then I'm going to rotate around to the side, double click my mouse, and I want to rotate this around. Now it's going to go 5 degrees at a time, which is going to be way too much. So I'm going to say minus 0.5 and get it a little bit closer. So that's looking okay, but it's still not perfect. So I'm going to take some of these vertices and I'm going to start to pull them up. Might be a good idea to view this from the left side because the way the fender rolls back under, and just play around with the height of some of these vertices. I'm going to pull that up a little bit. And this one in here, you can see that it's sitting kind of low, which probably means that we're going to need another edge in there. But usually it's not a good idea for us to manipulate individual vertices like this. But at this point in the shape, I think it's important that we get it a little bit closer. So I do want to play around with this. When you start to roll over the edge of the fender, you're probably going to want to pull it up and out instead of just up, because we want to stay essentially normal to the curvature. We don't actually have a normal direction. We could use the coordinate space over here and use normal, and that would help us a little bit, but this is going to get us close enough. And then I'm going to come up to the front here, and again, just try to manually stay normal. So it does look to me like we're probably going to need another division in here. So what I am going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to hide the mesh. I'm going to double click on this edge, and I'm going to see if I can insert an edge. And notice what actually ends up happening here. It's trying to insert an edge that goes here and down. And if we say okay, it gives us a result that looks all right. But remember, when we go into box display, what's going to actually happen is it's going to put something in that is perfectly straight. So from this point to this point to this point is a straight line, and that's not going to be good for our curvature. So we're going to have to manually manipulate this. And I'm going to start by taking this edge and just pulling it up ever so slightly. I'm going to go to a front view, and you can see it kind of goes up and then down a little bit, and that's not going to be good either. So I'm going to take this vertex down a little bit, probably take that one up a little bit, and this one probably down a little bit. And the same thing is going to be true as we rotate to the side, and we'll probably just select that vertex there. And again, we want to make sure that it's not completely flat, so we're going to add a little bit of curvature, rotate this around, and probably just take this edge here and pull it out just a little bit. Notice we're not looking, right now we're not looking at the actual mesh, we're just doing this manually. So you can kind of see that we've got a very gradual transition here, but then it dips back down and kind of goes back up here. So this vertex probably needs to raise up a little bit. And now I want to bring the mesh back. I'm going to go back into my smooth display. So rotate this around, starting to look pretty good. And again, this is time consuming. I mentioned very early on, if we have a really high quality scan, like it's something that you would see from a scan that's $20,000 to $100,000, and we got really good quality scan off of a high quality surface, so a fender that was perfect in every way, then we could just simply start pulling these points directly down to the mesh using the pull command. But that's not what we have here. So because we do have some inconsistencies in the surface. This means that we're going to have to manually play around with this and just try to move things around and get it a little bit closer. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but what we don't want to see is these sort of bulges that are coming up and out. We want to try to maintain some consistency here. Another thing that is important is when we look at this with our edges off and we rotate it around, again, we talked about this inconsistency in the surface. That's a graphics issue. There's another one that's popping up here. But we just want to make sure that everything, the lines flow from front to back. It's going to be really important on a surface like this. So just kind of wiggle it around and take a look at the light. Everything looks pretty good. Again, those are inconsistencies, and we can check those using inspect and curvature analysis. And if you don't see them popping up, if you don't see those issues highlighted here as a change in curvature, especially when you go to the principal maximum and you increase this limit here, then it's probably not an actual issue. What we're expecting to see is a radius of curvature that happens here, and there's one that's kind of going on here. All that stuff's okay. This is just a graphics thing, not something that we don't have to worry about. Okay, so that looks pretty good. If we bring back the scan, you know what? We haven't saved in a while. Let's save. Sometimes I get carried away and I kind of forget to save, but that is a pretty good result so far. Again, I'm pretty happy with that. At this stage, I want to begin pulling this forward, and I also want to begin pulling this back. I really need this to start to match the shape before I add that detail, that edge there. I need to begin matching that shape. So a couple ways that we can do this is we can manually start pulling these edges back and see if we can get it to match that shape. Generally, I would not do this in smooth display. I would try to do this in box display. It looks like we're probably going to have to add another edge, and partially because this edge here is relatively straight, and then it looks like it turns. But what I want to do is I want to pull these edges, and I'm looking for a nice sort of consistent transition. I'm going to select the entire thing, and I'm going to begin extruding this out. And I'm going to scale it down a little bit just to kind of get me close. And then I'm going to manually edit this. So again, we're looking to match the shape of the fender. We're going to have to play around with how close we want these details to be. But it's always a good idea to sort of work either in a single direction or in plane. I think it is important to maintain that because it's much easier to control the direction looking from the top and then looking from the side. When you try to move things around in 3D, it becomes really difficult. So I'm going to go to a side view. And from the side view, you can see that we're pretty high here. The fender starts to roll down and back. We can always do a quick check with smooth display to see how far we are off. I can see that we're pretty high up, so I'm going to start pulling this down and just double check on my smooth display. That edge looks like it might just be a little bit high in general. So just a quick check, I'm going to take that vertex, pull it down a little bit. I'm going to take this one, pull it down a little bit. This one, pull it down a little bit. And just keep manipulating these until I start to see that mesh come through. And then I can start to take this one down until it goes into the mesh. I can take this one down. Again, generally, we're not working in smooth display. I'm going to go back and forth between box display and just sort of play around with those. If you want to, we also can take this edge and use slide edge and pull it a little bit away because we are generally looking for, again, a consistent distance between those patches. So moving that around is going to help us get a little bit closer. Once again, just going to kind of manipulate this. And I know this is tough to kind of watch and go through. It does take time, and I did mention that in the very first video that it takes a good bit of time to recreate something like this. It's not just a quick 5 or 10 minute process. It does take, sometimes hours. That's one of the problems I typically have when we look at car modeling. And generally the car modeling, that stuff is going to take hundreds of hours. So if you actually spend the time to fully model and detail a car in CAD, it can take you hundreds to thousands of hours. And that's, oftentimes people want that information relatively quickly. They want to just kind of see the magic or the secret bit of information they need or they're missing to be able to do that. And oftentimes it's not quite that simple. It's a lot of little sort of bits and pieces and knowledge that happens along the way to sort of make that happen. Now, one thing I do want to note is when we're looking at the fender from this direction, it appears that there's a crease there, this style line that happens right here. And as we look at this from the side, that is happening right in between a face. I don't actually have an edge there. I have one here, and it kind of goes down, but the edge for that feature is not really there. So I need to have an edge there to help control that shape, and I just don't have it yet. So once we extend this in the front just a little bit, we're going to need to come back and sort of retopologize to get that. So the next step for me, I'm going to take this front edge. The back looks pretty good. I'm going to hold down Alt and extrude this forward. And then we're going to go through that same process of, sort of working out the shape. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set this pivot up top, and I'm going to scale it horizontally to start to pull that so it's more in line with the headlight shape. And then that just kind of gives me a good starting point to manipulate the shape. So again, you can work in box display mode. I highly suggest that you do get really comfortable working in box display because it will help you essentially learn how to make better geometry. So if you just work in smooth display, you're going to get kind of hung up with that final shape. And the final shape is obviously important. I mean, that's the end goal, is the final shape. But when you're just focused on that final shape, then a lot of times you miss out on all the things that you really need to be concerned with to make sure that you have good geometry, good clean geometry. So we're going to just continue to sort of pull these vertices, pull them in and around, and then I'm going to go to smooth display, and you can see that that's pretty close. It looks pretty close on the top. We might need an additional edge. So one thing we're going to find out is we're probably going to need another edge in here to perfectly match that shape. I'm not quite ready for that yet. And some of this other stuff here is going to have to be pulled in to really wrap around the headlight. But now that we're close with box display, I can go ahead and do some final manipulation here with smooth display to kind of pull these in. You can kind of see we're starting to fall outside of the shape here, so I am going to have to move some additional edges, but just work little by little, and always make sure that you are checking that smooth display and the box display. So here, might need to pull this back out. Let's check box display. Let's hide the mesh. And let's just take a look at our results. Because now what we're doing is we're starting to get a little bit away from the transitions here. So what I want to do before I get too far is I'm going to go to Insert Point. I'm going to come from here, and I want to come essentially straight down. Then I'm going to double click this and delete it. Now, again, I'm looking for consistent patches. It's a little tricky here once we start to transition the shape, but those consistent patches are going to help us. Now, this actually needs a little bit of adjustment, so I'm going to go to Make Uniform. And I want to pay close attention to the distance of those edges. I'm going to go to Box Display and then back to Smooth Display and see how it pushed it and made it actually a bit longer. That Make Uniform helps us transition from this wider face down to these narrower faces, and ultimately is going to give us a cleaner result. It's something that you're going to have to play around with from time to time. I can already tell that this lip here that we're rolling around is going to be problematic. We're going to probably have to have another edge in here. I'm going to just try to add one now. I'm going to go to Insert Edge. I'm going to put it right in the middle, but I'm going to use Exact. And again, when we use Exact, it's going to keep the exact same shape, which means that all the stuff that we did back here on the broad part of the fender where we didn't have a lot of curvature is going to stay. And all the stuff up front is it's going to stay, but this is the area that we need to adjust. So I'm going to take that vertex, I'm going to pull it down a little bit. Probably going to take this vertex here and pull it down and get that pretty good result there. We could make some adjustments to the fender here. Looks like we could pull this area down just a little bit. I'm going to take that vertex, pull it down. Actually, you know what? Let's take this edge right here and pull it down. That looks pretty good. And we'll take that one there. And we'll pull that down just a little bit. So as hopefully you're starting to see, there is a lot of micro adjustments. Again, we don't have to be perfect, but we want to get as close as possible so that way our final result looks pretty good. So far, I'm pretty happy with that. Let's go ahead and hide the edges and just take a look. All right, so again, we've been spending a lot of time. This area is going to need some work. That's okay. Everything on top looks pretty good. That's the area that I've been concerned with so far. So let's bring those edges back, go to a right-hand view, and let's save. Make sure we don't lose any of our work so far. So let's bring back the mesh and let's take a look at where we're at. So with the headlight bucket, it's going to get pretty interesting because right now we need to push this edge a little bit closer to where the edge of the fender is. We have an area here where we're going to be able to carry that forward pretty easily. As I mentioned in the last video, likely it's going to be, we're going to wrap over this opening, and that opening is going to get cut out after the fact just because it's going to be too hard for us to add all the different edges and details that we're going to need to make that happen. So that's probably just going to be open. You can kind of see there's a little dimple in here that is likely for a fog light, or a driving light. That is another detail that we're probably going to avoid because going from these four-sided patches to that circular indentation is going to be kind of tricky to do in forms. It's something that's going to be a little bit easier to do with surfaces after the fact. There are also some other details in here, like this little bump out. I'm not 100% sure if some of this is body damage or, a potentially part of the fender. And again, because I don't have this car, I found some pictures of these fenders and kind of get an idea. But likely what ends up happening with cars from this era is they will change little bits of the design almost every year on some of these things where there'll just be minor differences or minor tweaks. I know the US cars were pretty bad for that. Not bad, but just, they made those changes where, for example, I had a 68 Camaro, and 67 and 68 were similar, but not identical. 69 was a change, and then 70 was a completely different body, even though a lot of the underneath was the same. But just little changes each year, little minor differences in certain things. So that happens on, European cars, British cars as well. They make little changes like that. So I'm not going to worry too much about some of those details. We're going to get the general shape down. But I want to take this edge and I want to just push it a little bit closer. Once again, something that's important for us to do using the box display. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these vertices and pull them out. You'll notice that it ends up going a little bit below. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be perfectly above, but moving in plane can kind of help us. And ultimately what's going to end up happening is once we're happy with the overall shape, then we can extrude this edge with a crease and go down to make that lip. We're not quite there yet, but I want to just kind of get a little bit closer to that edge. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Remember, we're talking about designing or recreating this fender that's going to be a fiberglass part for race cars. And if you've ever tried to install fiberglass fenders or fiberglass parts on a car, you know that generally the fit is pretty bad because they just make a rough mold, and then it's kind of up to you to grind and cut and sand and trim and get everything to sort of fit just right. All right, so that looks pretty good. Quick check on the smooth display. It looks like we're pretty close to the fender, so I'm pretty happy with that. When you get to a point like this, Again, always save often. In Fusion, we can go back to the saved version at any point in time, especially when working in forms because we are not actually capturing any design history. That's the only way that you can go back. So with this, in order to get and match that curve, it's actually going to be pretty tricky unless we have more divisions here. So unless we insert more edges, we're not going to be able to sort of go around that curve. So for example, if I take this and I just extrude it out as a test, I'm going to go ahead and come to the front and pull this down. You can see that at some point we're going to start to go through. Let's go ahead and go to the side. I'm going to bring this back and potentially bring this up. I'm just going to do this as kind of a test, see if we can get the shape kind of close. I don't think that we will be able to, but it's always worth testing out, especially when you're working on a design. You can always undo. So I'm going to hold down Alt, extrude one more time, and sort of bring this down. That vertex needs to go up. This one over here is going to have to come in. This one can come in and down. Let's rotate this around. That probably is going to have to go up and back. And again, it's going to get us pretty close. So if we hide the mesh, that looks okay, but what ends up happening when we have this vertex here where we no longer have those edges, when we convert that over, this ends up being like a little bit of a ripple. It's a point on the surface, and it's not going to be ideal. It's not going to produce the best result for us. We can do a quick test. We can finish the form, which converts it back to a surface. And you can kind of see here this edge and this edge come into that corner. And if I go to Inspect and Curvature Map Analysis, and we kick this up, you can kind of see that we start to get this purple section here. And what this is telling us is that the change in curvature, or the radius, is pretty high at that point and then radiates out. If we take a look at principal maximum, you can see that it starts as a point there and then sort of radiates out. And what we'd like to see is something like this, where we've got a radius that's going to be carried back. As soon as we put that crease in the fender, we're going to see a red line that goes back. This is not what we want to see. That's not going to be a great result. So that's why I say that it's oftentimes it's pretty easy for us to come in and just extend or extrude a face out like that. But ultimately, that is not the way that we want to get the geometry, because again, we end up with what are essentially star points. Star points, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4 edges here. And really, it only wants to see a T point at these open edges. It only wants to see 3 edges, and we've got 4. Now, typically, 4 is not going to give us a star point on internal faces, but whenever we have it on external faces like this, when we're changing direction, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be problematic. So what you want to think about is what happens when we extrude this face. So for example, I come to the front and I hold down Alt and I scale this down. So this is where that star point comes in. So all these ones that were essentially T's on those open edges now have 4, and this one has 5. And remember, those star points, we want to avoid having those right where there's a change in curvature. So the only thing that we can do to kind of fix that is to insert an edge. And actually, let's go ahead and do undo, because I still had exact set for this. I want to use simple. And when we do that and we hide the edges, what we're essentially doing is we're moving that star point around. And while it can work, again, it is pretty tricky. It's something that we need to just be very careful of. And you can't just have that open edge. You need to have more geometry. You need to have more divisions there in order to push that star point away from the transition in curvature. Now, if we take a look at the actual fender, we're actually fairly close to that shape. It's actually not too bad of a result. It's not perfect, because you can see that we probably need another edge in here in order to make this work. And if we hide the mesh, we don't have one there. That's okay, we can add one. but it's actually not too bad of a result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on with this. I'm going to grab this edge and say insert. I'm going to put it at minus 0.5 in the other direction. Because we are using simple, it's going to mess up this shape right here. It's going to sort of flatten it out. And that's because when we go to box display, essentially what we've done is we've just added that flat there. So the way I'm going to fix this is I'm going to double click on the entire edge. Let's pull it up a little bit. And then we have to go back and we have to fix some of this stuff here. You see how it sort of dips down and then goes back up? That's obviously it's not gonna be a good result for us. So I'm gonna take this edge right here, I'm gonna pull it up, and what I'm looking for as I do this is I want the distance between these two edges here to be fairly consistent as I go back. And I don't want that dip in the fender because that's not gonna give us a good result at the end. Let's go ahead and just check the mesh. And it's looking okay, but obviously now it's sitting pretty high here. So we just have to unfortunately do a bunch of this like micro work to get this to fit. So I'm gonna come to the back and I'm gonna begin sort of manipulating these. I'm just gonna start to pull them down. And take a look at the smooth display. Maybe pull this edge down. It rolls away back here if we hide the mesh. It's not too bad, but it's not perfect. And again, we're just gonna have to sit here and we're gonna have to play around with these. So I don't know that that's really a good use of time. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take these two and I'm gonna pull them down a little bit. And I'm gonna take these individual vertices and pull them down. Let's go ahead and just move them little by little. Now, this is also kind of where this process differs from, let's just say best practices. When we're talking about best practices for form modeling, typically moving individual vertices is not the best way to do it. Because we have a mesh underneath this that we can kind of use as a guide, we can kind of get away with it. Again, it's not the best process, but sometimes we have to, work with what we have. And again, it's going to come back to the scan data that you have access to, how accurate it is to the part you're trying to replicate, and how much time you want to spend, right? If you're just trying to get something close, again, race car, then you don't have to spend all the time to really try to get this to perfectly match. But I am going to do a little bit more. I know the end result of this hopefully is fabrication. So I want to put in some time to get it relatively close. Again, not perfect, but you can spend more time sort of getting that worked out. All right, so let's think about where we're at. I want to fix this opening a bit. One of the things that I want to do before I go too far, before I really start to manipulate this, is I'm going to go back to make uniform again. And I want to take a look at this headlight opening and see how it changes. And then I want to go back to box display. And again, I don't want to see a flat section in here. So I'm going to take these two edges, I'm going to pull them up so that we're a little bit more rounded. I'm going to take this up. And again, I'm looking for a consistent, essentially parallel edges. I'm going to take this one and push it up. Remember, we're only working in plane from this front view, so we're only moving things vertically. As we go back to a smooth display, we should see a little bit more rounded, a rounded headlight opening now. This is going to need a little bit of work, and part of the reason for that is because now we've got shorter edges up here, and then we're transitioning to these longer edges. So if we want to get a little bit closer, we're gonna have to add an edge here, but that's actually a good thing because that's where we've got sort of that style line in the fender. And over here, we're probably gonna have to add an edge in order to get that shape to be just right. You can kind of see it's now a little bit inside of where it should be. And we'll work on that in just a second, but now is about the time where I wanna add the detail in for this edge. So you can see we're starting here. And let's go ahead and double click this edge if I can. And when we look at the mesh, it starts out pretty good. but it ends up a little too high. So that edge needs to be lower. And there's actually another edge here, and that edge is kind of crossing where we want that line. So this is not a good result. This edge really needs to be down here, and that edge needs to be a bit lower. So in order to make that happen, this one is going to have to move down closer to my fender transition, and this one is going to have to move down, or I'm going to have to insert another edge. So the way that I'm going to sort of go about this is I'm going to try to use insert point. I'm going to go from here, bring it to the midpoint, and then attach it back here. Then I'm going to double click and get rid of that. It's probably a little too close right there. We'll do a quick check of our smooth display to make sure it still looks okay. It still looks okay. I'm still good with that. And again, now this edge at the start and the end is okay, or it was okay. And now you can see that we moved that one edge. This is actually a pretty close to where it needs to be. It's a little bit inside the fender. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Insert Edge, and I'm going to put it relatively close and just below. And then we need to sort of pull that out to match the fender shape. So again, it's going to get a little tricky. I'm going to first take these, and I want to make sure, again, it's not a straight line, which it does. As soon as we use the Insert Simple option, I'm going to have to double click on this. As soon as we use the Insert Simple option, it's going to create essentially a flat or a straight line between those, and that's not what we want. So now's the time where we need to do a little tweaking. You'll also notice that the distance up here is pretty wide, and down here it's pretty close. This is going to potentially cause problems. So we might need to move this edge up. So I'm going to fix that first. Again, we're going to go to a right-hand view. Actually, let's try this from the top. So from the top, we're going to use Insert Point. And what I want to do is from this point here, I'm going to start to deviate back to here on the fender, and then get rid of that altogether. So it's not perfect. And then I'm going to come to my side view, and from here I'm going to go all the way to here, and I'm going to get rid of that other one. And we're getting a little bit closer to sort of smoothing those things out. So it looks pretty good so far. Really nice consistent distance between all these edges, and that's kind of what I'm looking for. And again, we need to take a look at the actual fender, and we'll probably need to move some of these edges out because it's not wide enough. If it's okay at the headlight, but it's not okay everywhere else, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select just past that, so here, and then I'm going to find that other edge, shift double click, and then I can go to modify and sort of just pull that whole edge out a little bit and change the shape of the fender. Good idea while that's selected to hide the mesh and also show the box display. And then likely what we're going to have to do is the same thing here, shift double click. This one, instead of just going out, it's probably going to have to go up a little bit. And again, what we're looking for is a nice smooth transition between everything. I know that's kind of, you know, the default thing I say here, but that's the case. That's really what we're looking for. So now you can see here in the middle, we can kind of see everything. It's a little bit bulged up here. Back here, it could still use a little bit of work. We could maybe pull this out just a little bit and pull this one out just a little bit. Again, generally this is not what we want to do. We don't want to just manually start pulling these out, but we are relatively close, so I'm making very micro adjustments. So very little. And now what we should see is that we've got an edge exactly where we want it on the fender. So now that we have that edge where we want it, we can go to insert another edge. And this is going to get a little tricky because it ends up in the headlight bucket. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these close together. I'm going to say okay. I'm going to hide the mesh. I'm going to hide the edges, Control and 4. And now when I rotate this around, I've got that sort of crease there. Now, the proximity of those two edges to each other is what's going to control how tight that crease is. So when we look at it in box display, they're relatively close. So if we want to adjust that, we can use modify slide edge. We can push that away just a little bit more. And we can take a look at the results. Again, Control and 4. And we can make it as as apparent as we need it to be for this car. All right, so that looks pretty good. It does need to sort of disappear at the front. And because we have that edge there, it's going to affect the shape of the headlight bucket. Now, I don't know for certain if there is a little bit of crease on the headlight bucket. The scan is kind of hard to tell. It looks like it carries all the way to about here, and then it sort of fades away. So in order to make that happen, what we're going to do as we get closer is we want the distance between these edges to start to spread out. And in order to make that happen, we're going to use modify and insert point. I'm going to take this one here. I'm going to start to spread it out right there. And then I can start to do the same thing to this one, start to spread it out just a little bit. And then get rid of that. And again, what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to take the curvature that we were creating, that's that really tight transition, and start to blend it and smooth it out. Now that we've sort of spread them out a little bit, we can begin to manually make some adjustments. So again, back to the front, and probably want to take this one in a bit as well. So I'm going to go from here, and I'm just going to bring it here, double click that and delete it. And then now we're going to make some manual adjustments. So again, we don't want a straight line between these. We're going to manually pull that out. When we get to sort of a shape like this, it becomes increasingly hard for us to make a round headlight opening. Now there are tools like Cylindrify that will actually allow us to go in and make things a little bit more round. However, this isn't truly round, right? It's sort of a teardrop shape because it opens up over here. So using Cylindrify is not going to be like a permanent fix for us in this case. But if we follow those same rules of making sure that we don't have a straight line between those 3 points, and we try to make everything as consistent as possible. Obviously, these are all closer together, but if we try to make things as consistent as possible, you can see that that's actually a pretty good result. So let's take a look at the headlight bucket. This needs to wrap under, so we are going to have to pull this forward a bit, which means that this extra extruded lip that we added needs to go away, because we're not going to be able to take, let's go ahead and rotate this to the side. We're not going to be able to take this and wrap it around. We're going to have to change directions again like we did up here. So in order to make that work, unfortunately, it's going to be even more work. It's going to take some time. So what I want to do is I want to kind of delete where we don't want things, and then we can continue to sort of make the transition. So we can't just take these quads and start to transition the direction. It's going to have a star point somewhere probably around here where we're going to start to go forward. What we can do is we can look at this from the side and we can think about where that can be. So we can start to extrude here and potentially get that to work out. But let's go ahead and let's hide the mesh. Let's get off of edit form. Let's select a couple of these faces. Unfortunately, it's going to make it trickier for us going forward, but let's delete those. If we take a look at it in smooth display now, it's going to be a bit messy. The stuff up here should still be fine. This stuff down here is going to be a bit messy, but that's okay. So what I want to do now is I'm going to take both of these edges and I'm just going to try to extrude them. So Alt, I'm going to pull them forward. I'm going to view this from the bottom, and I'm going to pull them back toward the car. At some point, I'm going to just grab a vertice here and pull that one back. Let's go ahead and look at it in box display. Pull this one back, pull that one back. And just like we did with the original shape, we're going to start with a large face, and then we'll divide it up as needed. So we're just going to try to get relatively close. And again, we're going to end up with a star point here. That's okay. We're going to leave a little bit of space here where we can add more detail as needed. So that looks pretty good. We can probably carry this down. So we're going to probably take it, all the way down here. We'll take that down. We'll take this one down. And again, we can divide this up as needed when needed. For this one, again, it's going to start to get tricky. But let's go ahead and I am going to shift, click that, and I'm just going to pull this whole thing down. This is going to mess up this fender lip, and we're going to have to divide it up again. But for right now, that's okay. So let's just work with, what we have. We'll pull it back, we'll divide it, and we'll fix the curvature later. And then for this stuff, we'll view it from the bottom. This is going to get pulled in, and that's going to get pulled in. And keep in mind that this takes time. I mean, I have, I don't know, hundreds of hours working on forms, and it's still a bit of a black art, right? I mean, we still have to end up playing around with these shapes and kind of figuring out what works and what doesn't work. From the side, I'm going to pull this over, rotate it around, pull it forward. And all I'm looking to do is get this kind of close, and then we can divide it up. So I'm going to pull that over, pull it forward. And let's take a look at it and smooth, hide this. And you can see what we're doing is we're starting to wrap that around. We're going to start dividing it up, and then we're going to add more edges here so that we can start to move that star point away. So back in box display, show the mesh. Actually, I'm going to say OK and save this just to make sure that we're not losing any work. So once again, we're coming up here on about an hour. So probably because we still have a lot of little detail work to do, this is going to take a good bit of time. But what I want to do is I want to get this kind of close. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time moving these vertices around. I'm going to pull this one back and just kind of make these a little bit more even. It's not perfect, but just kind of make them flow a little bit better. And once I'm okay with those results, I'm going to start dividing it up a bit more. So I'm going to double click there, insert edge, I'm going to do 0.5 right in the middle, and then pull it out. So we're going to start pulling it out with that vertex in there. So modify edit form, find that vertex, pull it forward. Again, we don't want it flat, so even if this is relatively close, we're going to pull these forward a little bit. Or we could potentially pull that one back and double check smooth display. So getting closer, you can see that we are going to need a bit more to probably going to end up with another star point under here, honestly, just because of the way that it transitions. So that's going to take a bit of work. But again, we just want to get it kind of close. I'm going to hide that. I'm going to say OK. I'm going to double click on this bottom edge, and I'm going to insert one vertically. Again, that is going to be a problem for geometry just to have that inserted. So I'm going to manipulate it slightly. I'm just going to move these points out just ever so slightly to make sure that it's just not flat. Kind of move them out roughly normal to the direction of their curvature. And we'll come back and we'll sort of fix everything after that. So smooth display. Not looking horrible, actually. It's looking better than I expect. Obviously, here is a problem because we went from having that headlight bucket lip to sort of this open edge. So just disregard that face right there because that will get fixed once we add that lip back to it. which, we will do because this is going to end up having more and it's going to carry up to here and sort of fill all that stuff in. So we'll get to that. But we do want to fix this bottom section here, which again is tricky because we're carrying the fender lip down, and we essentially want to carry this fender lip all the way over here. And when you get to this point in a design, it can be kind of hard to figure out how do we do this. Like if we just take this down, is it going to give us the result we want? Now the mesh itself appears to carry that fender lip all the way underneath and just sort of roll it to the midline where it meets the grill. So that's what it looks like to me, just looking at the scan. Now there's an inside of the scan that is kind of filled in, probably as a result of the scanner itself. So I'm not 100% sure, but it appears to me that that lip is carried down. So for me, what I want to do is I'm going to take these three faces. I'm going to carry that lip geometry that we already have, and I'm going to extrude it a bit. And then I want to take the rest of these edges and sort of pull them up. The reason I want to pull them up is because I'm going to take this entire bottom edge and just continue to carry it forward. Again, it gets a little tricky, based on the angle that you're viewing it. So you might need to rotate this thing around a bunch of times to kind of play around with it. But I'm going to go ahead and just hit Alt again and extrude it again. And then I'm going to do it one more time just to take it over. Not perfect, but essentially what we have is we have the geometry that we need. It's not in the right location. So again, move it around. I know that this is tough to follow because we are rotating it so much. But let's go ahead and move this one forward. And then, yeah, it's looking okay. I'm going to say Alt and 3 and hide the mesh body. So essentially what we did was we took this fender lip and we just sort of carried it forward and underneath where it goes. And the intent here is that we're building out some of the edges that we need, and then we can sort of go back and figure out, well, how do these things weld together, or what geometry we need to sort of fit in between. However, we now need to sort of rotate these edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two edges, I'm going to set the pivot point here, and I'm going to rotate them up. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to set the pivot point in and sort of just kind of rotate it up. We can manually move it, of course, but sometimes doing it this way can just be a little bit easier, and then we can make final tweaks. So now if we take a look at this, you can see that that lip is starting to roll under how we would probably anticipate it looks. All right, so again, let's go back to a side view. All right, so this lip right here, let's go ahead and roll this under. This is where it starts to transition. So what I'm going to do is pivot point here. And from sort of a back view, I'm going to start to rotate that up. And then this one here, kind of do the same thing. Pivot point on the inside where I want it to stay and kind of rotate that up. And then Alt and 3. So getting a little bit closer. Obviously, it's gonna take a little bit of work, but we are getting closer to the result we need. So I'll do it a couple more times. Pivot point here. I'm going to view it from the side and rotate that up. Looks okay. And honestly, it's twisting it a bit, so I'm going to bring it back that way. At some point, you might be better off just looking at it from the angle that you need. In this case, I'm going to switch to a left view so I can see it from the inside. And then just sort of moving it up to the right location. I'm going to do Control Z on that. This is really, it's really difficult to see, and it's going to be really difficult for us to visualize, but I am going to manually pick these vertices up and keep them roughly, roughly close to where they need to go. All right, So it's still going to need a lot of work, but we're getting closer to, I think, what it looks like. That lip kind of rolls underneath and kind of rolls forward. So let's just bring the mesh back real quick, see how far we are off. Remember, we're going to fill this section in, and we'll cut it out later. So we're relatively close. We're not too far off. Again, I don't know what that bump is. I'm not gonna worry too much about it. We can bring some of these edges forward a little bit. We can bring some of them back. But overall, I think that's closer than I anticipated it would be. So we still need to fill in this hole down here and fix that. That's okay. It's something we're going to handle in the next one. But at this point, that's actually a pretty good result so far. I'm going to hide the edges. So we've captured that sort of crease that's in the fender. We put those two edges together. The overall shape of the fender is pretty close. The area where it wraps around the headlight is pretty close, at least at the top. We still have to worry about the bottom. And we've started to roll around the front. And again, the intent here is fiberglass fender for a race car, so we're not worried about completely replicating the factory fender. Obviously, this doesn't look a whole lot different than what we started with at the beginning of this video. And then, unfortunately, if this is something you want to do, if you want to take scan data or even just make your own car parts, there's not really a shortcut. There's not a 5 or 10 minute shortcut if you want to go through the process. Now, you probably realize that we're using the same tools over and over again. We're using edit form. We're going back and forth between box display and smooth display. And we are just essentially reusing insert edge, insert point, edit form. And we also weld vertices from time to time. We slide the edges. But in essence, we're using essentially 3 tools to make this happen. Now, I can sit here and I can make little tweaks probably all day long. Like I could probably just sit here and make some slight adjustments here, bring it to here, get rid of that. And this is the way that it goes. If you're making something like this, you will literally spend a ton of time just making tiny little tweaks like that. But you want to make sure that you don't do that too early in the process. You really want to leave the detail work until the end, until you're happy with the general shape, because once you get past that handful of initial, edges that you add, past that initial shape, it's going to be extremely difficult to go back and make those big changes to the shape. So at this point, again, we've done quite a bit. We've added a lot of detail, even though it might not look like it. We've added quite a bit of detail. But at this stage, if you have any questions, please let me know. Obviously, as always, thanks for watching. Stay tuned, and there will be another video. I'm hoping that we can wrap this up in episode 3 and be done with the fender. Fingers crossed. I don't know. Again, we're going into this together blind, and we're just sort of walking through the process. So once again, let me know if you have any questions. Leave comments if you're following along and this is helpful. If it's not, then please let me know as well, because if this isn't helpful to anybody, then I don't really need to record hours of video doing it. But hopefully it is helpful to at least 1 or 2 people, and somebody can make a good result out of following this process. So again, thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.